Hey guys, it's Monday, March 30th. I hope you guys had a good weekend. I hope you got a chance to rest a little bit and do what you need to do to keep yourself just moving forward and just progressing as we get through all this. As I'll say as much as I can, I miss you, and I wish I could be giving you guys a quiz in person. That'd be way more fun. But for the time being, I'm doing my best to make this work so that I do get some chances just to see where you're at knowledge wise. So the Chapter 22 quiz, just some quick information. It is a 30-minute quiz. There are 15 multiple choice and one short answer. So if I do the quick math, that gives you approximately 1.5 minutes per multiple choice question and about 7.5 minutes for that short answer question to get all of that done within the 30 minutes that I give you for this quiz. This is kind of a non negotiable. I do need to set a time limit on it. And so I want you to stay on top of that timer. If you need to set one on your phone next to you, please make sure that you're not going to have any distractions during this time, as you won't have the opportunity to pause the quiz and come back later. You do need a 30-minute block to take it. It's expected, guys, that you will not share or discuss this test with anybody in this DE Bio class until submission time has passed, which the very end of submission time for this is Tuesday, March 31st at 3:25 p.m. If there are violations of this expectation, I do have a responsibility to report those violations to Colorado Mountain College. So please just do your best, as I always ask of you guys, and you've been phenomenal all year when it comes to quiz and test situations. I've been super proud of the work that you guys have done, and I know not every quiz goes exactly how you want it to, but we keep moving forward. And you know that doesn't make or break you in this class that one day. The work that you do over the course of this semester makes or breaks how you do. So just keep at it. Let's see. Otherwise, thanks again just for your respect to this kind of unique situation. And if you can just stick to my hopes and expectations, I appreciate it. As I jump over here, please don't wait until the last minute to do this on Schoology. As some of you guys have learned, if the internet gets a little slow, Schoology gets busy in the afternoons, you may have some problems with glitching and submissions that don't go through, which means we have to have a bunch of email conversations or text conversations later. So please make some plans to get it taken care of. I would suggest by no later than Tuesday morning. So that way you're not pushing yourself anxiety-wise on top of taking the quiz with the anxiety of trying to get it done right before 3:25 on Tuesday. Gosh, I think that's everything. I wanted to start with those announcements, and then I wanted to go fairly quickly through the review questions that I gave you on Friday that were posted. These are just concept check questions and some end of chapter questions in chapter 22. This, as it says, this is in no way covering everything that we learned about in chapter 22, but it is giving us a good feel for the different topics that were covered, and it's forcing you to do some thinking and hopefully not going straight to the answers. So concept check 22.1, number one. How did Hutton and Lyell's ideas influence Darwin's thinking about evolution? Well, these guys were geologists. And so their world was studying Earth and the geology of Earth and plate tectonics and just the actual rocks and minerals of Earth and mountains and valleys, etc. And they proposed that these events in the past that caused the mountains to be formed were caused by the same processes operating today, very, 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 very slowly. So this suggested to them that the Earth must be much, much older than just a few thousand years, which was basically the general thinking of society during that time, which was the early 1800s. So this shift in thought stimulated Darwin to reason that, well, if we've had that much time for Earth to shape itself so slowly over a lot more than a couple thousand years, couldn't that same principle apply to life? So couldn't that produce profound change in life the same way that the profound change that has happened here on Earth has occurred? So if the Earth was only a few thousand years old, Darwin's hypothesis for evolution would not have had enough time to produce that diversity of life on Earth. But since he had all that time to think about this process, he's like, natural selection could have led to the diversity of life that we see now on planet Earth. Concept check 22.2, number one. How does the concept of descent with modification explain both the unity and diversity of life? Organisms share characteristics as we look not just from human to human, but from human to all different forms of life. We share characteristics. That's the unity of life part, because we share common ancestors. The great diversity of life has come when new species have repeatedly formed, when descendant organisms gradually adapted to different environments, thereby becoming different from their ancestors. Down to 22.3, the last couple concept check questions. Explain how the following statement is inaccurate. Antibiotics have created drug resistance in MRSA. Or remember, MRSA is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. That's just a species of bacteria that has become resistant to methicillin treatment. Well, we want to really read that and pay attention to the words of it. Antibiotics have created drug resistance in MRSA. So if we look down below, it says new traits do not arise because of environmental factors. It's not like bacteria are all of a sudden just faced with this massive bacteria killer and said, whoa, what we could use right now is this resistance to methicillin. Let's see what we can come up with. No, that trait was already there in that population. It probably was just a dormant gene that hadn't been needed until that bacteria was exposed to methicillin. So there were already bacteria in that population, or those populations, that were resistant to that drug. So in this case, the ones that were resistant survived. The ones that were not resistant died. As those that were resistant lived, they reproduced and passed on their genes to the next generation, and so on and so forth. And that propagated methicillin resistance in that species of bacteria. So this caused an increase in the number of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, to the point where methicillin is becoming less and less of an antibiotic that is used because so many bacteria have become resistant to it. Number 2, there were 2 questions within there. It says, how does evolution account for A, the similar mammalian forelimbs with different functions, and B, the similar forms of the 2 distantly related mammals shown in a different figure? So this is basically walking us through, in A, homologous structures, and B, analogous structures. I know we spent some time talking in class about this. I went over some of this on the board. And A, in speaking of homologous structures, despite their different functions, the forelimbs of different mammals are structurally similar. Think about the bone structure of whales to bats to humans. They're structurally similar because they all represent modifications of a structure that's found in all of our common ancestor as animals. This is the definition of a homologous or of homologous structures. These are organisms or species that are more recently related. So I just put closely related. A better way of saying that is recently related. Okay. As we look at B, again, B, that figure is asking us about structures that are analogous. In this case, the similar features of these mammals represent analogous structures that arose by convergent evolution. Remember, if things converge, they come together to a common point, where before they started at very different points. So the similarities between the sugar glider and the flying squirrel, which are animals that we spoke about in class. I couldn't hear what you said. That's my watch talking. Sorry, guys. We talked about the sugar glider and the flying squirrel in class, and we saw that they had some very similar functions in their ability to glide/fly through the air, but they're structurally incredibly different. So that structural difference leads us to this not closely related or different ancestry conversation. So that's where we have to kind of differentiate between these terms of homologous and analogous. And these are the exact same terms I remember putting on the board for you guys a few weeks back. Homologous structures. These are structures between different species that are similar, but have very different functions. They're closely related or more recently related. I got it. And that explains to us divergent evolution, where there is a common ancestor. That's the point, that one point. And as those species diverged away from each other and became very different species, think, say, humans versus bats or whales. They became very different, but we can trace steps back to a common ancestor. That's divergent evolution. On the flip side, analogous structures, those are structures that are very different. Okay, the structures that allow the sugar glider to fly versus the structures that allow the flying squirrel to fly, they're not the same. And so that leads us to the conversation of those two species being not closely related and convergent evolution. As we go down to the test your understanding questions at the end of the chapter, number one, which of the following is not an observation or inference on which natural selection is based? Your answer is B. Poorly adapted individuals never produce offspring. And I would hope this is one that's not too difficult for us to reach and understand. But I just put in there in my explanation, be careful of absolutes in answers. It doesn't mean it's always your go-to answer, but just for a test-taking strategy. When you see the word never and the word always, unless those are things that we've specifically learned, that word jumps off the page to me as something that doesn't fit, doesn't work. The word never in answer B, come on, just because an individual is poorly adapted, it doesn't mean it can't reach reproductive maturity and make babies to pass on its genes, right? I got to figure we see it in the human species on a daily basis. But that goes for any species. All you got to do is make it to reproductive maturity. Natural selection doesn't immediately weed out those that aren't best adapted for survival and reproduction. Question number 2. Which of the following observations helped Darwin to shape his concept of descent with modification? Our answer is D. South American temperate plants are more similar to the tropical plants of South America than to the temperate plants of Europe. So it's basically saying, okay, we've got temperate plants in South America and Europe. They're both temperate. Shouldn't they be more similar? But actually what we see, since South America and Europe separated from each other continent-wise a couple 100 million years ago, there's been a lot of evolution since then. And so there's going to be a lot of divergent evolution occurring right there on South America that's going to create probably more similarities between these different types of plants on South America, the temperate and the tropical plants. Number 3 takes us right back to the MRSA question in 22.3, concept check number 1. Within 6 months of effectively using methicillin to treat Staphylococcus aureus infections in a community, all new Staphylococcus aureus infections were caused by MRSA. How can this best be explained? So our answer is C. Some drug-resistant bacteria were present at the start of treatment, and natural selection increased their frequency. Just more of them survived and made baby bacteria, and the ones that didn't have that trait died. Number 4, the upper forelimbs of humans and bats have fairly similar skeletal structures, whereas the corresponding bones in whales have very different shapes and proportions. However, genetic data suggests that all 3 kinds of organisms diverged from a common ancestor at about the same time. Which of the following is the most likely explanation for these data? So if we look at our answer, it says B. So B, natural selection in an aquatic environment resulted in significant changes. You can imagine as life in this instance led from walking organisms to swimming organisms, the evolution of the whale having that vestigial pelvis, our evidence states that whales' ancestor actually walked on land. And so when they made it into water, there was probably a pretty fast adaptation process, relatively speaking, not like overnight, but a relatively fast natural selective process where some just survived better because they were able to swim. And that led to significant changes, and that led to those bigger differences. Finally, number 5, DNA sequences in many human genes are very similar to the sequences of corresponding genes in chimpanzees. The most likely explanation for that result is probably A. And let me just triple check before I read the wrong thing. A, humans and chimpanzees share a relatively recent common ancestor. This goes back to our studies of biochemical evidence and the activities that we did back in class. When it comes to biochemical evidence, comparing DNA sequences, comparing amino acid sequences of proteins, the less differences in sequences, the more related the species are. It does not mean that one species evolved from the other, remember. It just means that they have a relatively recent common ancestor. All right, folks. I think that's all I wanted to mention to you. I wanted to make it fairly quick. As you go through this, as questions arise and you're watching this potentially Monday morning, if you want to text me or email me with questions. I'll be available to help clarify anything. But if you're ready, you'll be able to hop right in and take that quiz. It will be available from 8 a.m. on Monday morning, and submissions must be in by 3:25 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. So without anything else to really share with you, I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and give your families a hug, and I hope you guys are all doing well. I miss you.